There's a moment at every frontier wedding where the air goes still. Not the good kind of still, not the kind where a man catches his breath at the sight of someone he loves walking toward him. I'm talking about the other kind, the kind that settles over a crowd like a wool blanket soaked in creek water. Heavy, suffocating, wrong. I've attended 31 weddings in my 43 years on this earth. Cattle country weddings. Apache ceremony exchanges I watched from the ridge and didn't understand, but respected anyway. A Quaker service in a sod house where the bride cried so hard she couldn't finish her vows and nobody minded because everyone in the room was crying with her. I've seen brides who glowed, brides who trembled, brides who looked like they were walking to their own execution, and brides who looked like they were sprinting toward the only door that ever opened for them. I had never, not once in 43 years, seen a bride whose face was hidden under a flour sack. Not a veil, not a shawl, not even one of those heavy ceremonial cloths the Navajo women sometimes wore at transitional rites. A flour sack. Rough-woven, faded, still carrying the ghost of the MCALLISTER grain stenciling along the seam. Tied at the base of her neck with a strip of rawhide. Her hands, the only part of her I could see clearly, were folded in front of her the way you fold them when you've decided to stop fighting something. And the crowd, God help them, laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not the uncomfortable tittering of people who don't know how to react to something sad. Real laughter, the kind with teeth. The kind that passes through a crowd like fire through dry grass and leaves scorch marks on everything it touches. I was standing near the back fence post with a tin cup of something someone claimed was coffee and a notebook I'd been keeping since the Platte River crossing of '71. I wrote things down, always had, called it my ledger of peculiarities. My daughter thought it was charming. My 2 ex-wives thought it was evidence of a character deficiency. Maybe both were right. What I wrote in that ledger, on that afternoon, under a sky so blue it seemed almost aggressive, was this. Something is happening here that I don't have a word for yet. What came after, what that woman endured, what she chose, what chose her, I've spent 6 years trying to find the right words. I'm going to try again now. The town of Ridgecall, Colorado had the particular personality of a place that had almost become something, and then didn't. You know the type. You've ridden through them. There's always a bank that's too big for the commerce it handles, always a saloon that's too loud for the population it serves, always a church with fresh paint that looks slightly embarrassed about something. Ridgecall had all three, plus a mercantile run by a man named Delmore Prout, who had opinions about everything and the conversational stamina of a man who'd been alone too long. I'd come through Ridgecall on a cattle pricing circuit, not my own cattle, mind you, but a job I'd picked up after the losses of the previous winter made me renegotiate my relationship with pride. I was 43 logging miles for a Denver outfit that paid me to assess grazing contracts along the mountain corridors. Good enough work. Lonely work. The kind of work that keeps your hands busy and gives your mind too much room to wander. I arrived on a Thursday. The wedding was Saturday. By Friday afternoon, I knew everything about it, because in a town of 400 people, a story that good travels faster than weather. Her name was Isadora Vance. 26 years old, daughter of a man named Corbett Vance who had come to Colorado from somewhere in Tennessee with a wagon, a bad knee, and 3 daughters he intended to see married before the knee gave out entirely. The older 2, Ruth and Mabel, both of whom I met briefly and found to be perfectly pleasant in the aggressively ordinary way of people who have never been tested, had married local men in the preceding 4 years. Ranchers, good prospects. The community approved. Isadora was the problem. I heard this from no fewer than 7 separate sources between Friday morning and Friday night. The story shifted slightly in each telling, the way stories do when they pass through enough mouths, but the bones stayed consistent. Isadora Vance had been burned. Not badly enough to kill her, not badly enough to take her hands or her sight or her ability to speak. Badly enough on the left side of her face, across her jaw and cheek and up through her temple, that the town of Ridgecall had spent 4 years deciding what to make of her. And what they had decided was this. She was something to be pitied, something to be managed, something to be moved along. Her father, Corbett Vance, had a different view. He had decided, and I heard real bitterness in the voices of people who told this part, that Isadora would be married like her sisters, that she would stand at an altar, that there would be a ceremony, a celebration, a community witness. He had found her a husband. A widower named Gerald Foss, 48 years old, who ran a small dry goods operation out of a converted barn, and who had debts that made Corbett Vance's modest land parcel look very attractive. The arrangement, from what I gathered, had not been made with Isadora's enthusiasm. When I pressed Delmore Prude on this point, I was buying a tin of sardines I didn't particularly want just to have a reason to stand in the cool of the mercantile. He looked at me with the expression of a man handing over information he finds self-evidently true. "She don't really have a say in it, does she?" he said, not looking like she does. I wrote that down in my ledger, not because I agreed with it, because I wanted to remember exactly what it felt like to hear it. I almost didn't go to the wedding. The cattle pricing work would have given me a clean excuse. I had a meeting Monday morning with a man named Sorensen up the mountain pass, and I could have spent Saturday in preparation, checking figures, reviewing the grazing maps I'd been handed in Denver. That would have been the sensible thing. But something kept pulling at me, a quality in the air that I recognized from certain moments in my life when I was about to witness something I would regret not witnessing. It's not a comfortable feeling. It feels like a hook in the soft tissue just behind the sternum. I've learned, over the years, not to ignore it. I put on my better shirt. I polished my boots to a degree that, on a cattle pricing circuit, qualified as formal. I went. The ceremony was held behind the church, in the open air, because Ridgecall's church interior could hold perhaps 70 people and half the town had shown up. Some of them, I realized quickly, were there the way people go to a fire, not to help, just to watch. I found my spot near the back fence post. I poured bad coffee into a tin cup from a communal pot someone had set up on a folding table. I opened my ledger. And then Isadora Vance came around the corner of the church. She was walking, and this was the first thing I noticed before anything else, with a posture that I would have called deliberate. Not proud, not defiant, deliberate. Like a woman who has decided exactly how she is going to carry herself through something she cannot escape, and has made the decision so thoroughly that it is no longer a decision, but simply a fact of her body. The flour sack was already in place. Her father was beside her. Corbett Vance was a thin man with a gray mustache and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a battle they won't name. He was not holding her arm tenderly. He was holding it the way you hold a gate that keeps swinging open. The laughter started at the front of the crowd. I watched it move. It genuinely moved like something physical from the people closest to Isadora backward through the assembly. Some people didn't laugh, but their faces did something adjacent, a pulling away. An almost wince that was somehow worse than the laughter because it was more honest. I looked at her hands. She had folded them in front of her, and she kept them folded, those hands, through the entire walk to the altar. They didn't shake. They didn't clutch at each other. They were just present, still, communicating something that I did not yet have the language for. Gerald Foss was already waiting at the altar. He was a wide man going soft around the middle, with the look of someone whose face had arranged itself into permanent mild resentment. He glanced at Isadora when she arrived, looked away, and spent the next several minutes studying a point somewhere above the preacher's left shoulder. The preacher was a young man named Brother Caleb who looked like he'd been handed this assignment after more experienced men found reasons to be elsewhere. He moved through the opening words with the speed of someone who has decided that efficiency is a form of mercy. I was watching Isadora. I'm a man who keeps a ledger, which means I'm a man who watches. Not in the predatory way, I hope not. More in the way of someone who has spent a long time trying to understand things that don't announce themselves. And what I saw in the set of her shoulders and the fold of her hands and the way she breathed, slow, controlled, through the nose, was something I recognized. Not resignation. I'd seen resignation, this wasn't it. It was something harder to name. Something in the territory between endurance and refusal. Like a woman who has agreed to walk into something without agreeing to be destroyed by it. The preacher had just reached the part about, if anyone present knows reason why these two should not be joined. A formality that in my experience produces exactly 0 interventions in real life, when the sound came from the tree line. A horse, moving fast, too fast for the terrain. The kind of riding that says the rider doesn't care about the comfort of the animal or the approval of whoever is watching. Every head in the crowd turned. I turned too, and I saw, coming down through the scattered pine at the edge of the Ridgecall clearing, a man on a gray horse I would not have bet money on surviving the descent. I had heard of Eli Carr the way you hear of weather systems in mountain country, as a distant, abstract force that occasionally becomes relevant to your immediate situation. He'd been described to me variously in the day and a half I'd spent in Ridgecall as a hermit, a mountain man, a lunatic, a former scout, a man who had lost something up there on the Sangre de Cristo range and had never come back down to look for it. And this from Delmore Prout, who had an opinion on everything, not someone you want arriving when you didn't invite him. He looked coming through those trees on that gray horse, like a man who had been made by the mountain rather than choosing to live on it. Everything about him was vertical and weathered, not old exactly, maybe mid-30s, but carrying the density of someone who has spent years at altitude where the air is thin and the decisions are permanent. His coat was elk hide. His beard was not the cultivated kind. His eyes, when I finally got close enough to see them, were the particular gray of granite that has been rained on so many times it has given up fighting the water. He pulled up at the edge of the assembly. The crowd had gone quiet in the specific way that crowds go quiet when something appears that they don't have a prepared response for. I watched Brother Caleb lose his place in the ceremony and not find it again. I watched Gerald Foss's face do something complicated. I watched Corbett Vance's hand tighten on his daughter's arm. Eli Carr sat on his horse and looked at Isadora Vance for a long time. Not at the flour sack, at her hands and her posture and whatever he could read in the part of her that wasn't hidden. "I've got 40 acres on the south face," he said. His voice was the kind that carries in open air without effort, the way a hawk's cry carries. "Good water, clean soil, a cabin that's weatherproof. I don't drink more than is reasonable, and I've never raised a hand to anything that didn't need killing." The crowd was absolutely still. "I don't know this woman," he said, "but I know what's being done here, and I'm offering her a choice she maybe didn't get." He looked directly at Isadora. "That's all I'm saying. The choice is hers." I was writing in my ledger. My hand was moving before my brain had fully processed what I was watching. What I wrote was, he looked at her hands. Because that's what he had done in those first seconds when he came out of the trees, before anything else. He had looked at her hands. The silence that followed lasted long enough for a crow to cross the sky from one tree line to the other. And then Isadora Vance reached up and untied the strip of rawhide at the base of her neck. She did it without hurry, without drama, without the theatrical flourish that a woman in a novel might use to announce a transformation. She simply reached up with those still, quiet hands and loosened the knot and lifted the flour sack off her face. What I saw and what the crowd saw and what Eli Carr on his gray horse saw was a woman's face. On the left side, the burn scar, yes, the one Ridgecall had spent 4 years deciding how to classify. It ran from jaw to temple in a landscape of healed damage. It was not nothing. It was not something you could look at and feel nothing. On the right side, a face that was angular and precise, with a jaw that had the set of someone who had made up their mind about something. Dark eyes that were looking at Eli Carr with an expression I can only describe as measuring, the look of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, to calculate risk very carefully. She held the flour sack in her folded hands. She looked at Eli Carr. She said, in a voice that carried to the back fence post where I was standing, "What's your name?" "Eli Carr," he said. She nodded once, "Isadora Vance." Another silence. "Your 40 acres," she said. "Is the soil workable, or are you saying good the way men say fine when they mean adequate?" Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, a recognition maybe. "I'll let you look at it before you decide anything," he said. She turned to look at Gerald Foss. He was already looking at the point above the preacher's shoulder again. She turned to look at her father. Corbett Vance had the expression of a man watching a situation develop that he doesn't entirely understand, but suspects might cost him something. She turned back to Eli Carr. "Then I'll look at it," she said. She walked, not toward her father, not toward Gerald Foss, not toward any of the assembled faces of Ridgecall that had laughed or winced or pulled away. She walked toward the gray horse and the man on it, and whatever was on the other side of that tree line. The crowd let her through because crowds always let through someone who is moving with that kind of directness. There's something biological in it, something that says, this one knows where she's going. She didn't look back. I watched her go. I watched Eli Carr extend a hand and help her up, Not onto the saddle behind him, but beside him, which meant he was going to walk the horse, which meant he had thought about this more than a sudden impulse would have allowed. I watched them move into the trees. I stood there by the back fence post for a long time after the crowd began to dissolve, breaking into the smaller currents of people who needed to talk about what they'd just seen, people who were furious, people who were confused, people who had opinions already formed and were looking for someone to share them with. I wrote in my ledger, I still don't have the word for it, but I think it might be the thing that comes just before the word beginning. Then I closed the ledger, poured out the rest of the bad coffee, and went to find out whether there was any of that wedding food left. There was cold venison and a very good cornbread. I ate it standing up, looking at the tree line. Somewhere in those pines, a woman was looking at 40 acres of soil and making a calculation. I found myself, unreasonably, hoping the soil was as good as he'd said. I did not follow them into the mountains. Let me be clear about that because it matters to the kind of man I am, or try to be. A man who keeps a ledger writes things down, he doesn't insert himself into them. There's a discipline to observation that requires you to know where your role ends. My Monday meeting with Sorensen was canceled when word came down the pass that Sorensen's herd had a sickness, and he was in no condition to discuss contracts. This left me in Ridgecall longer than planned, which was either providence or a punishment. I genuinely couldn't tell at the time. What I know of the next 3 weeks I know from fragments. Pieces of conversations I collected the way a man collects firewood. Not all at once, not from the same place, but eventually enough to build something that produces warmth. The first piece came from a woman named Hazel Trent, who operated the laundry at the south end of Ridgecall's Main Street, and who had the invaluable quality of saying exactly what she observed without editorial enhancement. She told me 4 days after the wedding that Corbett Vance had come to her establishment in a state she described as white around the mouth, which was her idiom for controlled fury, and had asked her if she'd heard anything from Isadora. She hadn't, she told him so. He told her, and this is the part Hazel repeated with a precision that told me she had saved it, that Isadora had made a fool of the family. That what she'd done was no different from what Eli Carr had done, which was disrupt and humiliate. That a daughter who walked away from a proper arranged marriage toward a man who lived in the mountains like an animal was a daughter who had abandoned her understanding of what her situation required. Hazel Trent had looked at Corbett Vance and said, "Her situation as you've arranged it." He had not come back to the laundry after that. The second piece came from Brother Caleb, the young preacher, who found me one evening at the communal fire pit that Ridgecall maintained at the center of its small plaza, a habit left over from harder winters when people gathered heat. He was a sincere young man with the quality of someone who has recently begun to question several things he was trained to accept. He sat down without being invited and stared at the fire for a while. "Did you know," he said finally, "that Gerald Foss told 2 men at the saloon that he was glad she left?" I said I hadn't known that. Apparently he only agreed because of the debt situation and the land. He said he was dreading it. Brother Caleb's voice was careful, the way voices get when someone is reassessing something while speaking. He said he was going to get through the wedding night by thinking about other things. I put down the coffee I was holding because I didn't trust my hands. "He said that," I said, "to 2 men at the saloon who told 4 more. Brother Caleb looked at me. "Ridgecall knew that. Everyone at that wedding, they knew what she was walking into, and they laughed at her. There's a particular moral weight that settles on a person when they realize that a situation they were observing was darker than they understood in the moment. I sat with that weight for a while and didn't say anything because nothing felt adequate. "I've been thinking," Brother Caleb said, "that maybe I should have said something before. When Corbett Vance came to arrange the ceremony." "What stopped you?" "He's a deacon," he said, and then, "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it isn't." We sat with the fire for a while after that, both of us cataloging our respective silences. The third piece, and the most significant piece, came from a man named August Polly, who ran freight on the mountain passes and who had, by circumstance, made a delivery to Eli Carr's homestead 2 weeks after the wedding. August Polly was not a man given to long speeches. He was the kind of man who communicated in the compressed language of people who spend most of their time alone. He found me at the livery, which was where I'd taken to spending time because the smell of horses is one of the few things I find reliably calming, and he said, "You're the one who was watching from the back fence." I said I was. He nodded slowly, studied me with the appraising look of a man deciding whether information is safe to share. "She's there," he said, "on the south face." I waited. "He built her a room," August said. "Off the main cabin, her own door, her own fire. She told him, and he told me this straight, didn't make it a big thing, she told him she wasn't going to be a different kind of arrangement. He said he understood." I absorbed this. "So she's living there," I said, "but not." "She's looking at the soil," August said. And there was something in his voice that was as close to admiration as I'd heard in Ridgecall. He said she spent the first 4 days just walking the 40 acres, tasting the soil. That's what he said, tasting it, like she was reading it. He shrugged, in the way men shrug when they've said more than they intended. She asked him for a planting guide. He didn't have one. He rode down to Pueblo and got her one. He walked away before I could ask anything else. I stood in the livery with my ledger open and wrote, "She asked for a planting guide." And then I stood there for a long time just looking at those 5 words, because they seemed to me to contain something essential about a person who is, at the age of 26, with a burn scar and a flour sack, and a wedding that became a public humiliation, remaking herself not out of nothing, but out of the precise materials available. It was another week before I got the full picture of those first weeks. It came in pieces from August Polly on a subsequent freight run, and from a young Apache man named Tasawi who worked seasonal labor on several of the mountain homesteads, and who spoke more English than people in Ridgecall assumed he did, a fact that served him well in terms of the information he quietly accumulated. Isadora, by the account of both men, had spent her first week on the South Face homestead in a state that looked, from the outside, like calm. She'd accepted the separate room. She'd accepted the planting guide. She'd walked the acreage in a systematic grid pattern that Eli Carr watched, he told August this later, with a feeling he described as like watching someone read a document I'd never understood. The second week was different. The second week, the calm had a tear in it. Tasawi was the one who told me this, and he told it in the particular way of people who have watched grief and know better than to editorialize. He said that he had come to the South Face homestead to help with the fence repair Eli Carr had asked him about, and that while Eli was working the near fence line, Tasawi had gone to the far corner to check the post anchoring, and he had found Isadora sitting on the ground beside the creek with her back against a cottonwood tree. She was not crying. She had been crying, he could see that, but she had stopped. She had her knees pulled up and her arms around them, and she was looking at the water with an expression he described, with the careful precision of someone translating across a conceptual distance, as the face of a person who is counting up what they've lost. He had not interrupted her. He had gone back to the fence posts. But he told me she was sitting in the water light. The way it came through the cottonwood, she was letting it come through on her on the left side. I asked him what he meant. "The side of the burning," he said simply. "She was sitting so the light fell on it, like she was deciding something about it." I wrote this down carefully. I asked Tasawi if he thought she was going to be all right. He looked at me with the patience of someone who has been asked many questions that assume a simpler world than exists. "That's not the right question," he said. I waited. "The right question," he said, "is whether she is going to become who she is." That evening, I went back to my room at the boarding house and opened my ledger and sat in front of a blank page for a long time. What I was trying to work out was something about the nature of a choice. Not the choice Isadora had made in front of the crowd, the dramatic one, the visible one, the one that the town of Ridgecall was still arguing about over fence posts and in mercantiles and at the communal fire. That choice I understood as well as I understood anything. The choice I was trying to understand was the invisible one, the one that happened alone, beside a creek, with the mountain light coming through cottonwood leaves and falling on scarred skin. The choice about what you allow yourself to become after everything has already happened to you. I've made some of those choices myself. Most of mine I made badly or too late or in the wrong company, but I know what they feel like from the inside. They don't feel like choices. They feel like weather, like something that is happening to you and that you are also somehow causing. What Tasawi had described, a woman sitting in the light she'd spent 4 years turning away from, letting it land on her, was a version of that choice that I didn't have words for yet. I wrote she let the light in. And then I crossed it out because it was too easy, too finished. The real thing was messier than that. The week I finally went up to the South Face homestead, I went because August Polly was making another freight run and offered me a spot on the wagon, and I said yes before my better judgment had a chance to weigh in. I told myself I was going to deliver a message. I did have a message, a letter that had come to Ridgecall's post office addressed to Miss Isadora Vance, with a return address in Tennessee that suggested it was from family who hadn't yet heard the revised version of events. I was a convenient reason, and I was willing to be used as one. The south face of the Sangre de Cristo Range was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Something more severely beautiful, maybe, something that announced its difficulty. Instead, it was simply vast and quiet, with the particular piece of places where altitude has thinned out everything unnecessary. Eli Carr's homestead sat in a natural bowl of land that caught the afternoon sun and held it, and the 40 acres spread out from the cabin in the way of land that has been thoughtfully managed, not tamed exactly, but worked with. She was in the west field when we arrived. August had told me she'd been working the soil prep, which in late season meant turning and amending, getting the ground ready for the spring planting she'd clearly already decided on. She was using a long-handled tool I didn't immediately recognize, something between a hoe and an adze, with a weighted blade, and she was working with a rhythm that said she'd been at it for hours. She stopped when she heard the wagon, straightened, shaded her eyes with one hand. She looked, I thought, like someone who had been somewhere. Not somewhere geographical, somewhere interior. The kind of journey that doesn't show on a map but shows in the quality of how a person stands. She walked toward us without hurrying. When she got close enough for me to see her face, both sides of it, in the afternoon light that fell without bias, I noticed that she had stopped hiding the left side. She was simply standing in the sun with all of herself present. "August," she said, then she looked at me. "You're the man from the fence post." I was startled enough that I almost dropped the letter. "You noticed me." "I notice people who are watching without laughing," she said. "It's a small category." She held out her hand for the letter. I gave it to her. She looked at the return address for a moment, and something moved across her face. Not grief exactly, but its close cousin. And then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "Tennessee," she said, mostly to herself. "You don't have to," I started. "I'll read it when I'm ready," she said, not defensively, just as information. Eli Carr came out of the cabin then. He was carrying 2 cups of something, and he handed one to August and looked at me with the assessing gray eyes of a man who takes a while to decide about people. "You kept a notebook," he said, "at the wedding." "I do," I said. "I hope that's." "She saw it too," he said, "when she walked past you." I looked at Isadora. She was looking at the west field, at the turned earth catching the late sun. "You write things down," she said. "Good." She said it like it settled something. "Then maybe you should write this down for whoever reads it after." I got out the ledger. "Tell me what you want written," I said. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up a handful of the turned soil from the edge of the field and let it run through her fingers. She was reading it. I understood, the way August had said she could. The mineral content, the moisture, the tilth. "Write that the soil is good," she said. He wasn't exaggerating. I wrote it. She looked at me then with both sides of her face, full and direct. "Write that I'm going to plant potatoes in the near field, winter wheat in the far half, and I'm going to look into the apple root stock that Tasawa's family works with in the lower valley." I wrote it. "Write that I'm aware people are waiting to see if I fall apart." A pause. "Write that I'm not planning to." I wrote that too. She walked back to her west field. She picked up the weighted adze. She went back to work. I stood there with the ledger open in my hands, and I understood for the first time since the fence post what I had been watching. Not a woman surviving, not a woman escaping. A woman building, the way you build something that is meant to last, with attention to foundation, with patience about timing, with a clear-eyed understanding that the weight of what's coming is significant but not more than the soil can hold. Eli Carr stood beside me, watching her work. "She's going to ask you to stay for supper," he said. "I'd say yes." I said yes. Supper on the south face was venison stew and a cornbread that Isadora had made herself. and it was the best meal I'd eaten since Denver. And I say that without nostalgia distorting the memory because I wrote it down that night in precise sensory terms. The char on the bottom of the cast iron, the juniper in the stew, the way the cornbread had a sweetness from something she'd added that I didn't recognize and was too self-conscious to ask about. There were 4 of us, me, August Polly, Eli Carr, and Isadora. Tasawi had come in from the fence line for the tail end of the work and had gone home to his own camp before supper. He had family staying through the winter preparation season, he'd said, and he'd be back in the morning. The conversation at that table was one of the things I find most difficult to write accurately, because the things that made it significant were not the words but the spaces between them. Eli Carr talked about the winter coming early. He had signs of it that I didn't know how to read, patterns in the elk movement and the snowline, and something about the way the creek had been running that he described with the specificity of a man who has replaced almanacs with direct observation. He talked about what the homestead would need through February and March and into the melt. August talked about the freight routes shutting down for the season and what that would mean for supply. There were things you could get through November and things you couldn't, and the line between them was drawn by elevation and weather and how much you'd planned ahead. Isadora asked questions. She asked about specific items, not what I would have expected from someone who'd been in Ridgecall her whole life, shopping at Delmore Prout's Mercantile. She asked about seed catalogs that could be ordered and received before the spring, about a particular kind of graft tape she'd read about in the planting guide, about whether the South Faces aspect would support a root cellar at a specific depth given the frost line. She asked these questions the way she'd asked Eli Carr about the soil at the wedding, with the precision of someone who has learned to collect practical information before she allows herself to plan. I was eating and watching and trying to understand the dynamic. It was not between her and Eli what I would have called a domestic scene in any conventional sense. There was no performance of partnership. He didn't refill her cup unnecessarily. She didn't defer to him on questions she clearly had opinions about. When he said something about the Westfield's water retention that she had a different view on based on her 3 weeks of grid-walking the acreage, she simply said so, and explained her reasoning. And he listened, and then said, "You're probably right," in the tone of a man who is genuinely updating his view rather than conceding to keep the peace. At one point, August said something about the cabin being cozy for 2, and Eli said, without embarrassment and without making it ceremonial, "She has her own room, her own door. We're working this land together. What comes after that is what comes after." August looked at his stew. I looked at my stew. Isadora looked at Eli with an expression that I can only describe as cautious recognition. Like someone who has set a test so many times that they are genuinely startled when the result comes back as expected. After supper, when August and I were washing dishes at the outdoor basin, there was a pump fed by the creek that Eli had built himself, an impressively functional thing. August said quietly, "She wrote to her father." I kept washing. She told him she wasn't coming back, that she wished him well, that she hoped he'd square the debt situation some other way. He handed me a cup to dry. He sent a letter back. Delmore Prout told me. He said Corbett Vance said she was making a mistake, that she was throwing away whatever chances she had left. I thought about the Tennessee letter in her apron pocket. Whatever chances she had left, I said. Yeah, August shook his head. He wasn't a bad man, I don't think, just a man who had a specific idea of what her situation required. The word Isadora had used, I realized. Situation. As though she had already internalized her father's language for her circumstances and then, quietly, completely, rejected it. The night after supper, when August went to the barn to sleep near the horses, he preferred it and didn't need to explain why. And when Eli had gone to check the north fence before the last of the light died, I sat by the outdoor fire that Isadora had built against the chill, and she sat across from it with the Tennessee letter open in her hands. She had read it sometime during the dishes or after. I didn't ask when. She held it in both hands, not looking at it anymore, looking at the fire. "My aunt," she said eventually, "in Tennessee." She folded the letter with the careful exactness of someone who has decided what to keep. "She says she heard what happened. She says she thinks I was brave." She said the word brave with a faint irony that wasn't self-deprecating, more like someone examining the accuracy of a label. "Were you?" I asked. She looked at me over the fire. "I don't know what I was," she said. I was standing there with that thing on my face and I could hear them. I'd heard things like that before, 4 years of things like that, but it was the first time I'd heard it from everyone at once. A pause. It was like being inside a sound. She looked back at the fire. I wasn't being brave, she said. I was trying to breathe. And then he came through the trees and he wasn't looking at me the way everyone else was looking at me. He was looking at my hands. She held up her hands in front of the fire. Working hands, dirt still in the creases despite the washing. I have good hands, she said with a directness that was neither vanity nor performance, just fact. I've always known I had good hands, good sense of soil, good sense of when things need water or air or time. My mother taught me, before. A pause that I didn't fill. Before the burning, she said. I waited. It was a kitchen fire, she said. Not, it wasn't interesting. I reached for something and my sleeve caught and I put it out myself with the floor rug. My mother was outside. No one saw it happen. She looked at the scar on her left hand's edge. I put it out. I always thought that mattered, that I put it out, but that's not the part anyone remembered. I thought about what Tasawi had said. The right question is not whether she'll be all right. The right question is whether she's going to become who she is. What is the part anyone remembered? I asked. That I changed, she said simply. That I was one thing before and something else after, that the after version was less. She said the word less the way you handle something that has been cutting you and you are carefully setting it down. My father was embarrassed. He tried not to be. He was anyway. Ruth and Mabel were kind. The town was what it is. She was quiet for a moment. And then 4 years of it, she said. And then that wedding and then the flour sack. I said carefully, did you choose that, the flour sack? She looked at me. My father suggested it, said it would be easier for Gerald Foss. A pause. I agreed. The word agreed sat in the air. Why? I asked. She looked at the fire for a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe she wouldn't answer, and I respected that boundary. I was reaching for my ledger to give my hands something to do when she said. Because I had decided to go through with it, the wedding, the arrangement. She said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. I had decided that this was available, that this was what was offered. And if I was going to do it, I was going to do it without making anyone more uncomfortable than necessary. She looked at me. That was how small my world had gotten, she said. Right there, trying not to make anyone uncomfortable. The fire crackled. Something in the tree line made a sound, an owl or the wind. And then he came through the trees, I said. And looked at my hands, she said, and asked me to make a choice. She folded the letter from Tennessee and held it loosely. I didn't know him, she said. I still don't know him, not really. 3 weeks isn't knowing. 3 weeks is the beginning of a possibility. She was precise about this, I noticed. She didn't reach for sentiment. But when he said, the choice is yours, I thought, when has someone said that to me? When has anyone stood in front of the people who are laughing at me and said that what happens next is mine to decide? I wrote it down. I didn't ask permission. She saw me writing and didn't stop. The flour sack, she said, when I took it off. A pause. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I wasn't trying to show anyone anything. I didn't want to wear it anymore. I was done wearing it. She said this with such simple clarity that the grandness I'd been attributing to the moment, the drama of it, the symbol of it, suddenly seemed like my imposition. She hadn't been performing. She'd been finishing something. Quietly in front of a crowd, she had finished something. People in Ridgecall think I made a decision about a man, she said. They think I picked him over Gerald Foss, or picked freedom over arrangement, or whatever story they're telling. She shook her head. I made a decision about myself. The man is, she paused. The man is someone I'm in the process of learning about. Whether he becomes something else, that's for more than 3 weeks to determine. I thought about what Eli had said at supper. What comes after that is what comes after. 2 people, I thought, who have both been somewhere interior, who are both, in their separate ways, extremely careful about what they promise. The fire was burning low. I should have added wood, and I kept not adding it because I didn't want to disrupt the conversation's atmosphere, which was a sentimental thing to think, and I knew it but did it anyway. Your aunt in Tennessee, I said. Are you going to write back? Yes, she said. What will you tell her? She thought about it. I'll tell her the soil is good, she said. I'll tell her I'm planting in the spring. I'll tell her I don't know what I'm building yet, but I'm building it on ground I've walked myself. A pause. I'll tell her not to worry. She stood up. She added a log to the fire herself, which she did with the casual efficiency of someone who has been managing fires her whole life and does not require assistance. She looked down at me with both sides of her face. "You're going to write about this," she said, not a question. "I am," I said. "Why?" I thought about it honestly. "Because I've been trying to find the right word for what I saw at that wedding for 3 weeks," I said. "I thought if I understood more of it, I'd find it." "Did you?" I looked at my ledger, at all the words I'd written and crossed out and written again. "Not yet," I said. Something in her expression was close to kindness. "Let me know if you do," she said, and went inside through her own door. I stayed 2 more days on the south face before the freight schedule pulled August back down to Ridgecall, and I rode with him. The work of those 2 days was ordinary in the way that good days often are: fence posts, water channel clearing, laying in the last of the winter provision stacks. Isadora worked in the west field both mornings, and in the afternoons, she read the planting guide at the outdoor table with the focused attention of someone studying a language that, once learned, will change what they're able to say. Eli Carr, I came to understand in those 2 days, was a man who had suffered his own kind of ending. I didn't get all of it, and I didn't press for it, but the outline was there in the things he didn't say, and the way he occasionally looked at the mountain above the homestead with an expression I recognized as the expression of someone who has made peace with something by living near it. He was not, I thought, a man who had rescued Isadora Vance. He was a man who had offered a door and then stepped aside. The difference mattered. I kept thinking about it on the ride down. The last morning, before August had the freight wagon fully loaded, I walked out to the west field where Isadora was working. The sky was the particular deep blue of high altitude in autumn, the kind that looks painted because real things can't quite achieve that color. The turned earth had a quality of readiness about it that I understood mostly aesthetically, but that she clearly understood at a much deeper and more specific level. She heard me coming and didn't stop working. "You're leaving," she said. "Freight schedule," I said. "I'll be through the pass again in spring, most likely." "The potatoes will be in by then," she said. "Early May if the frost cooperates." I stood there for a moment. I had the ledger in my coat pocket. I always have the ledger in my coat pocket. "Isadora," I said, "can I ask you something?" She stopped working and turned to look at me, both sides of her face in the autumn light. "The night of the wedding," I said, "when you were walking up to the altar before he came through the trees, what were you thinking?" She was quiet for a while. The wind moved through the high pines above the bowl of the homestead. Something distant, an elk maybe, made a sound that the mountain absorbed. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "about my mother." She looked at the west field. "She died when I was 19, a year after the burning. She was the only person who looked at me the same way after as before, like nothing had changed about who I was." A pause. "She used to say, 'The ground doesn't care what you look like, it cares what you do with it.' She said it about farming. I think she also meant other things." She picked up the weighted ads. I was thinking, walking up to that altar, that I was about to do something she would have looked at me differently for the first time, and I couldn't decide whether that mattered more or whether surviving mattered more. She looked at me. And then there was no more time to decide because he came through the trees. She turned back to her work. "Maybe that's your word," she said, not looking at me. "The thing that stops you when you're about to disappear into what's expected of you, whatever that is." I took out the ledger. I wrote it down, all of it. Standing in the west field with the October light coming in slanted, and her working the soil beside me. I didn't find the word that day. I'm not sure I found it ever exactly, but I found something close. I found the moment when someone decides that surviving is not enough and asks for something more and gets it. It's not one word, but it's true. The following spring, May, as she had said, the potatoes in, the winter wheat showing, I rode through on the pricing circuit and took the pass up to the South Face homestead. The west field had a quality that stopped me before I reached the gate. Not the quantity of what was growing, it was early still, but the care and the spacing, the exactness of the rows, the evidence of someone who had spent a winter planning and had executed the plan with patience. Eli Carr was repairing the north fence. He saw me and lifted one hand, nothing more needed. I walked toward the field. Isadora was at the near edge, kneeling, checking the soil moisture in the way she did, pressing 2 fingers in, reading something from the resistance. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. Her face was in full sun. She didn't move to angle it away. "Ledger man," she said. "The potatoes look good," I said. "Better than good." She stood up, brushing her hands on her apron. "I'll know more by July, but—" She looked at the rows. "It's going to be a real harvest." She said it quietly, not triumphant, just accurate. I got out the ledger, I wrote it down. "It's going to be a real harvest." She went back to her work. I stood at the edge of the west field a while longer, watching the spring light move across the rows. Somewhere below, down in Ridgecall, people were still arguing about what had happened at that wedding, what it meant, whether it was right or wrong or foolish or brave. Up here, none of that was the point. The ground didn't care what you look like. I closed the ledger. I put it back in my coat pocket. The Tennessee letter, I later learned, had started a correspondence. Her aunt had written back, and back again. The aunt had grown up farming, as it turned out, tobacco country, different soil, different challenges. But soil. The letters were long. They talked about rootstock and grafting and the particular problems of high-altitude growing seasons. Her aunt signed each letter, according to Isadora, with the same phrase. "Still learning, still here." I've thought about that phrase more times than I can count. I was 43 that October at the fence post with the bad coffee and the ledger. I'm 49 now. I've ridden through Ridgecall 6 times since. I've gone up the pass twice more besides that spring. The South Face homestead has a root cellar now. At the depth Isadora specified that first supper, based on the frost line calculations she'd done herself. The apple root stock didn't come from Tasawa's family in the end. It came from a nursery in Pueblo that she found through a seed catalog she ordered in her first winter. But Tasawa helped with the grafting and considers the trees partially his, and this seems fair. The last time I went up, I didn't see Isadora in the field. I found her at the outdoor table, the same one where she'd read the planting guide that first autumn, but now she was writing. A letter, it looked like. Long. She didn't see me immediately, and I stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, watching. And I thought about the flour sack and the rawhide knot, and the moment she had lifted it off her face without drama or ceremony, just as the simple act of being done with a thing. And I thought about what she'd said at the fire. "The choice is yours," and how rarely someone says that, and what it costs to say it, and what it costs to hear it, and what it costs, the most expensive thing, to believe it. She looked up and saw me. She raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more of an acknowledgement. I raised mine back. I didn't go any closer. I didn't need to. I had what I came for. I turned the horse and went back down the mountain. I still haven't found the single word. But every time I open the ledger, and I still do, every day, in the early mornings before the day has its say, I look at the page from that October, the one I wrote on the fence post before I understood anything. Something is happening here that I don't have a word for yet. And I find still that I don't mind the not having. Some things are bigger than their names.